When did you first grow curious about the paranormal? Dare you dig deeper? You are listening to House of Asher.
Hey everybody, and welcome to House of Asher. I am your host, Steve Asher, and you're probably listening to us on Paranormal UK Radio, which carries us globally, as well as Stitcher, Spotify, iHeart, SoundCloud, and just a whole plethora of different formats that carry us out there into the ether. We're listening to, or actually you are listening to, and I guess we are too, to episode 111, and what we're doing today is, as you guys know, being that, I've written about, ghosts and goblins and all that kind of stuff, and I've always been a fan. That's the whole reason that I do this little podcast, is that I love the subject, and even sometimes when it turns a little spooky, which one of the things that was always an interest to me. I am not by trade a demonologist, but it's one of those type of things I love to see and live vicariously through people who are brave enough to go out there and do that type of battle. I'm, if I get in anything too dark, I pull back and contact a priest or someone of a religious background. I kind of know my strengths and my weaknesses as well. So what we're doing is we actually have a very special guest on today to talk about that, and that is Mr. Keith Johnson. Hey Keith, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Like I was telling you a little bit offline or off air, I've kind of followed you and your brothers and your wife's adventures and all that, especially in the time that you guys went national. I know you guys have done stuff forever. I believe between you and your wife, you've got about like 50 plus years experience, and that, you're no slouch. So again, that's what I love, is being able to pull people on who really have the time vested and beat the shoe leather and all that, and it's really fun having you on.
Well, thanks. I appreciate you asking me on, and I'm very much looking forward to this. I have been for a while.
Well, and I appreciate it. We've had a couple of different little mishaps with the studio and stuff, and then thankfully everything is in good shape now. Right. Good things come to those who wait and whatnot, at least from my end. So anyway, let's touch on a little bit about how you come about this. I know everyone generally has sort of an origin story, and that's sort of my tag. What's your origin? I was a big comics kid and all that, so everybody, something happened or a series of things happened or whatever. Why demonology? Was this something that was more or less kind of in your wheelhouse in regards of your religious upbringing, or was this something that you discovered, or was this something that was kind of thrust upon you in some odd situation?
Well, I did have a Christian upbringing as a very young child, and was always interested in. I remember my parents, especially my mother, speaking to me about the angelic realm and the demonic realm, that there were angels and demons, and it's something I really believed in. I didn't totally really understand it, but it was in the back of my mind. We had some odd things going on in our house now and then, things disappearing and things materializing that we didn't know what they were, things like that. For example, there was suddenly a lady's riding glove that seemed like from a past generation in the middle of the hallway, and then we looked again and it was gone. Things like that you knew something was happening. But as time went on, this became more and more of a reality to me. I did want to study it, and because I did believe they were angels, I did believe there was the opposite, there were demons, and of course I did believe in God as well. And it got to a point where I knew there were some people that were very, very disturbed by this, and I thought to myself, gee, I'm intensely interested in this, and I do believe in it. I am studying this as much as I possibly can, but is there any way to really help people, except maybe talk to a few friends? Is there any? Remember, this was a time, quite some time ago, before there was the internet available to the public, so it's interesting how that came about. I did pray about it, and it's a short time later that my brother and I attended a lecture at Rhode Island College, and who was speaking but Ed and Lorraine Warren, advertised as Seekers of the Supernatural from Monroe, Connecticut. And I thought, hey, they're here in New England, same as us. So we saw them, and they spoke. They did speak about demonology. Ed especially spoke about spirits that have never walked the earth in human form. We met the Warrens afterwards, became lifelong friends with them. And it was shortly after that lecture that we were invited to become members of our first paranormal group, which was based at Rhode Island College, which was PIRO, Parapsychological Investigation and Research Organization, PIRO for short. And that's really how we started. That's how my brother Carl and I started. And interestingly, that our first in-home case was a very heavy demonic case, because I had put an ad in the paper about our services. I figured that's the only way to advertise our services. And lo and behold, we were contacted 3 weeks later by a lady who lived in Harrisville, Rhode Island. And of course, that case became the basis for The Conjuring. So that's how we basically started out. And of course, years later, when I was married, Sandra was introduced to this phenomenon, these things going on. And of course, she has very firm Christian beliefs. So we basically started devoting ourselves as much as we could to helping people who are having problems with the paranormal and who are very, very frightened and disturbed by this, because a lot of people are afraid to talk about it, but when they see somebody who will not condemn them, they usually they're eager to contact and very, very accepting of any kind of assistance. So that's basically how we all got started.
Well, it's the thing. I was hearing you talking about meeting Ed and Lorraine and the belief in demonic forces, and it's always kind of struck me funny. As you know, I'm from Western Kentucky and grew up with kind of the Southern Baptist tradition and whatnot, and but and it's always struck me funny that there's folks that will believe in aliens, they will believe in Bigfoot, they will believe in all kinds of things, but when you start talking about demons and things like that, it's strange. I think maybe it just doesn't meet what their worldview is. It sometimes touches on, people talk about maybe spirit guides and angels, but they don't look at the dark end of it. And
Right.
there's that duality in life. It just is, and it always amazed me that I don't. It was just such a funny thing. It was one of those deals like some people would go, okay, well, I believe in whatever, but it was just again, it was just really weird. Did you find coming into the thing in regards of demonology that other people who maybe you knew in the paranormal field, either maybe they just didn't get it, maybe not, maybe they didn't make a judgment call, but they were just sort of like, okay, we're more about contacting human spirits, but is the thing that they just didn't realize a lot of times when you go through a Ouija board or even EVPs, there's a certain amount of conjuring involved in that, and you don't know what's coming through.
Right. Oh, that's absolutely true. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes, we did find that a lot of the paranormal groups, especially early on, they would kind of shy away from the demonic and even the angelic. They didn't really want to concentrate on the inhuman, the non-human aspect of it. And to me, I never really had a problem with that. I always thought, well, we exist. Why can't other intelligent beings exist? And it wasn't that much of a forced belief to me. I always believed it. But most of the groups were very much into communicating with human spirits. Somebody's contacted their dead uncle Fred or whoever on a Ouija board, and we're trying to help this spirit. We're trying to find the spirit, help it find closure. Maybe it doesn't know that it's dead. We've got to talk to it, and that will stop everything. But we did find that it was kind of deeper than that. A lot of times it was deeper than that. Even in my own family, my brother and sister they started using the Ouija board, and of course, once they got something, it kind of becomes addicted when you find out there's something actually speaking back to you, communicating back, and
Sure.
they wanted answers, questions, and answers, and everything. So it actually increased the activity in our home. We had minor activity before then, but after they started communicating regularly with spirits on the Ouija board, that kind of seemed to open up a gate, whatever you want to call it, portal, whatever. But it really, really intensified after that to the point where it was starting to get visual and even physical. My sister did get pushed at one time, inanimate objects moving. So, yes, so we did find that a lot of times people really, really kind of shied away with that. Like you started talking about anything to do with the demonic realm. Suddenly the room gets very quiet and really it's very, very can be a very, very uncomfortable subject. And of course, when The Exorcist came out, that changed a lot of things too. That really blew people away, and that was very, very monumental. That this is not about some ghost that doesn't know that it's dead. This is something that's imitating human spirits, and it's trying to work its way in, and it gets control of the family to a large extent. So that can be very, very disturbing. And that's where we found that a lot of people were, even other Christians, of course, and I don't blame them. It can be a very disturbing, very frightening realm. So sometimes you had to be very, very cautious over who you spoke about or introduced the subject with.
Right. Well, and the thing too that people forget, which I'm just shy of 50 right now, so I remember the world before internet. But it was even excluding the internet, the context of demons and angels and whatever different forms were more or less relegated to Sunday services, and that was fine. You could talk about it then, but it was almost like, well, that doesn't happen now. Like you've heard people say, well, miracles don't happen now, which I think they do.
Yeah.
You would probably categorize me as an agnostic. I would like to think something's out there, but I just don't have the faith right now, and that doesn't mean that won't come as I grow a little bit older. We'll see where it goes. But
Yeah.
It's so funny because when you guys were like the vanguard, you guys are really some of the first people. Obviously, you had guys like Hans Hoser and people like that, but that really delved strictly with dark entities and dark objects and things like that. It was really. I've always sit and scratch my head, going, that was pretty well. It was pretty ballsy. There's no other way of putting it. Just because, like you said, you get so much backlash, especially in the South. If you were anything other than an ordained minister or whatever, it was like, well, you're dabbling with force. I'm sure you've heard it 100 times. You're dabbling with forces you're not ready for, and you're not whatever. And it's it had to have been hard on you emotionally too. I mean, because like you said, I know, like I said, both you and your brother do demonology and stuff. Were you guys where you could kind of help bolster each other and kind of support each other, which I'm assuming being twins you would have anyway?
We did become very supportive of each other in this field. Yes, we had to at the beginning, and of course we've had our differences of opinions and slight differences of belief. But
that's brothers.
Right, exactly. Well, especially being identical twins, of course. Yeah, but we realized that we were very much the minority as far as being involved or even interested at all in such things as demonologies, and the awareness that there is another, whether you want to call it another species out there that is vastly intelligent, that you can't always see, you can't always touch, but it is there and it exists. And again, I never really had a problem with believing that something can be incorporeal but still have an intelligence, still interact to a certain extent with the physical realm, and still be a non-human species. It boggles your mind, but I was always willing to accept that possibility. And it's surprising how a lot of people get very, very disturbed by the notion that we're not it. We're not the only thing out there that can think and reason and manipulate.
Well, the human ego. There you go. Everybody wants to think they're on top of the food chain, and the thing that was always that kind of I don't know how to say it. It interested me and it puzzled me because late 18th century, early 19th century, especially there was a lot of spiritualism going on, the spiritualist movement and things like that. And now, I mean, you do have like spiritualist churches and things like that today, which I find very interesting because it seems like they kind of incorporate the gifts that some people naturally have, just like Lorraine had. And, depending on the political, or not so much political climate, but the societal climate of whatever time, she could have very well been a Joan of Arc figure, a couple hundred years ago.
Oh, yes.
So it kind of comes in ebbs and waves. Now there's more new agey stuff, and so it's a little bit more acceptable. And but it's interesting because it seems like every so often there are a handful of people, guys like, well, we had a gentleman named Edgar Casey who was born maybe 30 miles from where I live today in Western Kentucky. Right. Very unassuming guy, and through his works, just kind of like the Warrens and yourselves, you can kind of see the sort of fruit that you're bearing, the positivity that you're doing. And, after a while, it's kind of hard to contest, which, don't get me wrong. I mean, obviously Ed and Lorraine had their detractors. But that's anytime you step out from what's the norm, you're going to have that. Well, let me ask you, in the stuff that you and your wife has done, now, I know that the area that you guys are kind of from is kind of like Vampire Central. I mean, I'd always heard vampire stories and always heard all this different stuff. And I've always found that really interesting. What is something that you had found that maybe surprised you from where you're from?
What surprised me was the fact that how, I wouldn't say common, but not uncommon, this phenomena is. It's New England is steeped in of course tradition, and for the smallest state in the Union, in the nation, where we have a lot of diversities, a lot of cultural diversities here. There's several languages that are primary here, and of course we had the Salem witch trials and everything, the very infamous Salem witch trials, which took place in Salem, Massachusetts, 1692, 1693. So a great deal of folklore has gone on in this area, but you'd be surprised how many like old houses and older families have this in their tradition. Like things have been happening that are unexplained for many, many years, and it still surprises me, I'll tell you, when I find out how many people have this in their history. I lived in this, or maybe the house's history. Things are going in our house, and you find out that, there was a neighbor two houses down that had similar things. There's a neighbor next to them. You find whole pockets of communities here that streets seem to be affected, entire streets, houses in every street. Apartment buildings, one apartment after another will have this things happening, and it's been going on for at least a few centuries that these things have been going on. Yes, we do have a belief in vampires. At least we used to, because that's how people dealt with disease. They turned to folklore, and somebody passes away in the family, then another family catches the contagion, another, and they kind of thought a spiritual remedy by disinterring the corpse, go out in the backyard, dig up your relatives, and you find, this person hasn't decayed properly. That must be what the spirit is using to be a repository for the energies. It's sucking off the energies of sleeping relatives. So let's destroy this corpse. Let's take out the heart and burn it, and maybe the soul will be put to rest.
Well, it kind of like the story of the Revenant and stuff. There was a story I had saw not too long ago, and they were talking about where they had found a skeleton in a Romanian wall with a brick in its mouth. And, it was one of the ways, and I think they'd put an iron spike through different spots in its body so it couldn't rise. And, and people kind of poo-poo that stuff away. And it's easy to kind of go, well, it's a kind of a backward area or something. But we're not that far from it. People
True.
slip back into superstition very easily. I was going to tell you something too, because we mentioned the witch trials. I had done some like one of those 23andMe type genetic DNA tests,
Mm-hmm.
and there was trying to remember the lady's name. It was one of the Salem witches. And I use witches in quotation.
Mm-hmm.
It was the elderly lady who died in the cell. They were trying to get her land. She was a widower,
Yeah.
and they had threatened her daughter, who had just had a baby, and said, "Well, look, we'll take them as well." And she said, "No, it's fine. I'll give you whatever. Just let them be." And that was like my, I guess, eighth or ninth great grandmother on my mom's side.
Really? Wow.
Weird, right? And it's strange how just the weird connections with people, and it's really funny like that. But you were talking about vampirism, and which brings me to the story of Mercy Brown.
Mm-hmm.
Could you
Yeah.
elaborate a little bit on that for the people who's maybe not as familiar with that story?
Sure. Interestingly, I had some friends visiting this past weekend. My friends Lisa Hatchett and her son Max Wagner, and of course they're investigators from Oklahoma, and they were taking a trip across the country. And they stopped. They're good friends of mine. They stopped here, and I gave them a tour of the Exeter, Rhode Island cemetery where Mercy Brown and her family are buried. And essentially, what made this so popular, this particular story, was that it was very late. I mean, this was going on in 1892. There was a farm family named Brown, very prominent family name in Rhode Island, of course. You've got Brown University and such. And the mother had died, age 36. She had died of tuberculosis, pulmonary tuberculosis, which they called consumption because it consumed, it wasted away people. And then 6 months later, the sister had died. The eldest sister had died, Mary Olive. And, of course, they were both buried, but then no one was affected for several years. Then in about 1890, 1891, the eldest son, Edward of the Brown family, he was actually the only son of the family. He came down with the symptoms of tuberculosis, so he was sent out to Colorado Springs with his young wife. A very, very strong, husky young fellow, but he started wasting away dramatically. So he did go out to Colorado Springs and drank of the mineral water. The air seemed to help him. Meanwhile, while he was away, another sister, Mercy Lena Brown, was 19 years old. She came down with it, and she died very, very rapidly. She had what was called the galloping form of it because it was just so rapid that she wasted away. Meanwhile, he had a relapse. Edwin, the eldest son, the only son, had a relapse, came back to Rhode Island with his young wife, essentially to die, but there were people in the Grange, and this is where it was very mysterious because they had these farm granges who were almost like Masonic groups, and they apparently secretly told Mr. Brown, George T. Brown, the father, that even the Grand Master had this in his family, that a daughter had sickened and died, and said, "This is how we took care of it: disinter the body. You've got to disrupt the corpse. You've got to cut out the heart because that's where they believed that the soul was back then." And burn it on a nearby rock, and that will free that there will be no more deaths. So George Brown didn't believe in this. He didn't want to follow the superstition, but as his son was seriously ill, finally he felt he had no choice. He would do anything to try to save his son, even though he was not a believer in the superstition. So as late as 1892, he called in the medical examiner who agreed to do it, Dr. Harold Metcalf. He was the county coroner and medical examiner. He only agreed to do it because he was paid to do it. So it was Mercy had died on January 17th, 1892. She was put in a holding crypt that's basically dug out of a hill to await the spring thaw. So that's where her body was placed.
Right.
So on March 17th, exactly 2 months later, a dozen men from the farms and the local church, which was right nearby, began digging up the bodies, and they disinterred the body of the mother, Mary Eliza Brown, and she had pretty much gone to the earth. She was just in a partially mummified state, but there was no viable flesh there. Dug up the daughter, who had died 6 months later, and she was just a skeleton, except with a long growth of hair on the skull. And then they disinterred Mercy. from the holding crypt because the ground had been too frozen, and they were shocked at what they saw because there she was, perfectly preserved. Now, the medical examiner, Dr. Metcalf, said there's nothing really unusual with her state of decomposition. And they didn't seem to realize that, yes, she'd been buried in the 2 coldest months of the year, so she was probably frozen solid, so she was just thawing out.
No insects to help break her down either.
Exactly. But Dr. Metcalf did perform an autopsy right there in the cemetery, removed her. I mean, it's such a tragedy that she had died, but at least she had no awareness of what was going on. These are her fellow parishioners looking at her naked body being cut open in the middle of the day. It's hard as it seems, and her heart and lungs and liver were removed, and there was some coagulated blood in her heart. So they figured, well, this is not the doctor, but the townspeople figure out, well, this is the vampire. This is where the vampire spirit is resting. One thing they could not medically explain, though, is that she had turned over in her grave. For some reason, she was in a sleeping position when they opened up her coffin. And
wait a minute, she moved around in the grave.
Yes. She was buried above ground. They opened up the lid. There she was, not laid out in a peaceful repose, but she had turned over. She was in a sleeping position, like she had turned over in her grave.
That's strange. That's weird.
God forbid she was buried alive, but I mean, if she was, there was no sign of. I know there was no sign of a struggle. So if there was any life to her, she probably just froze. And but she was in a sleeping position, and her hair and fingernails appeared to have grown. Of course, that's natural too. As the skin starts to recede, it will give that appearance.
I'm sure the gums will do that too.
Oh yes, the gums will do that, and it'll make it look like the teeth have actually lengthened. So after Dr. Metcalf was paid and left, they actually burned her heart on a nearby rock. They saved the ashes, however. They saved the ashes from Mercy's heart, mixed them with water, and gave them to her ailing brother to drink in his tonic, so that hopefully that would somehow counteract the disease, the spiritual disease. So he did consume the ashes of his sister's heart. Unfortunately, that had no effect. He died less than 2 months later, but they figured he was just too far gone, so they'd done the right thing. Mercy was buried, and I assume she was giving a Christian burial. However, they did not put an epitaph on her grave, unfortunately. There was no Christian scripture or blessing or anything like that that was inscribed on her gravestone. But as the years went by, people claimed to have seen glowing lights in the cemetery floating around near her grave. Some people claim to have seen a spirit walking around of a young woman. It's never been totally documented, but there have been a number of mysterious things that have happened. I know somebody who went in there, a young woman went in there with her friends. Suddenly the car door locks by itself, and she started to panic, and when it unlocked, she got out of there and never returned. People have seen mysterious lights floating in the area. Very, very strange things, but to this day, the story persists of Mercy Brown, that she was a vampire and that they destroyed her. And she was obviously a young Christian woman, she's very talented quilt maker. One of her quilts still exists. But that's the story of Mercy Brown, and because it became so popular, I mean, this is as late as 1892. It made its way to the Providence Journal, and then even Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, published that in 1897. When he passed away, his wife found newspaper clippings related to the Mercy Brown case, so he had obviously been studying that too.
Right.
So very, very popular. It became a well-known legend. And because it made them look like superstitious fools, that really stopped the practice of disinterring relatives and cutting out the heart and burning it and such. So that's the story of Mercy Brown. But she's very, very. If you see her gravestone today, there's a metal band around it, a steel band. That's because it was stolen in 1992, the 100th year anniversary. And I guess town officials put an ad in the paper. Look, if you return the stone, we won't prosecute, no questions asked. Somebody returned it, so now it's really got a band in there, and people leave candy, they leave coins, they leave trinkets, little
Right.
toys,
Little
dolls.
homages to the child.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So very, very popular place in Exeter, Rhode Island, and I love the history of it. I love the history that this is actually a true story that happened here in Rhode Island as late as 1892.
Well, that's and that's the wonderful thing about folklore, because it's a thing that growing up, I always loved. I was lucky enough to have a mom from her people come from the Appalachian Mountains, and
Wow.
and my dad had a lot of English German, and so there was
Mhm.
a lot of folklore and superstitions and like the whole whistling past a graveyard stuff that kind of comes with you, and
Mhm.
so it's one of those deals where you are already kind of steeped in it, sort of in a similar situation but slightly different, and it was always. That was always the fun part for me to go into graveyards. I love to visit them because you look at all the different stones and the dates and wonder, what this person's life was. And of course, then that leads you to studying history, studying genealogy. It's sort of like a gateway drug. You become a
Yes.
researcher
Right.
by being
Mhm.
immersed in that. There's actually a story I don't know if you've heard of, and I won't get too deep into it, but in a nearby town of Marion, Kentucky, there was a mother that had a young daughter, and I guess she was an herbalist or something like a midwife or something. But she would make tinctures and things to help women go when they're going through their um, um, birthing. Maybe give
Mhm.
them like red cohosh to help their uterus to loosen up and or whatever.
Uh-huh.
I'm not exactly 100% on the details of that, but well, they decided that this woman was a witch. Her husband had died, perfect foil, and
Mhm.
they basically are. There's two stories.
Mhm.
The legend is that they convicted her of witchcraft, more or less a lynch mob type deal. Um, Burnt her and the child, who was maybe 6 years old. It was a Ford family,
Mhm.
and they swore up and down they weren't, and they buried the mother outside hollow ground, outside of hollowed earth. Now they did allow the child to be buried in the ground after it had been blessed, and it has this big wrought iron fence around it. It's all like intersecting crosses, and they even put gravel and then finally concrete because people used to would try to lay on the grave because they'd say the little witch would get you.
Mhm.
And people would report seeing this little blonde-haired girl, but of course, part of her hair is burn off, and her little white nightgown or whatever cinched around the bottom, and just it's just a horrible story. But then I heard later in researching it, the family says no, she had died of something like consumption or scarlet fever, but then also came another death certificate that said something like death by fire, and the dates were wrong. So there were two like by 7 or 8 months. So then there you go. That's right for conspiracy and all that stuff. So I get what you're saying on that. And what was it? P.T. Barnum said, "Never let the truth get in the way of a good story."
Right.
I think is who it was.
Exactly.
And that's the thing of it. Some of this you have to kind of take with a grain of salt and say, if nothing more, it's an interesting tale. Um, Now I know that when you were talking about vampires, I mean, obviously there are other things like psychic vampires and different types of
Yes.
supposed beings out there. Now, I've met some people that I kind of felt like were their psychic vampires, but they didn't. It was more like they were
Mhm.
just that type of dark personality. Have you encountered anything like that?
Yes. Yes. Actually, I have. There have been vampire cults, and of course, we think of New Orleans and everything, and uh, down south there as being like the vampire cults, but we've had them here too, and actually, there was a case that took place, and Ed and Lorraine Warren were involved in this as well. There was a young woman, a teenager really, back years ago, who would dress in goth attire. She'd dress up with a long cape and everything, have the garish makeup on, and she'd wait outside of cemeteries, and sure enough, a young guy would come out and stop by and, hey, who are you? And she'd put the bite on them. She'd actually wait and put the bite on them, and she actually sent one young man to the hospital, to the emergency room, because she just gave him such a wicked bite on his neck. So she had this obsession, so.
Well,
but yeah, these things do happen, and I've known people to actually practice it here in Rhode Island. I've known some people who would not really harm each other, but would take a little sample of each other's blood, and they figured that would empower them in some way, because they're drinking of the life force. Sure.
Well, what's so interesting too is that, I mean, people think of vampirism as something that's more of like a Hollywood creation, but I mean, it goes back like 4,000 or 5,000 years, or back. I think it was the first stories with like in the Greek tales, and it's really interesting because there are people who actually have deficiencies and things like that. Just you'd have people with lycanthropy or some sort of different things where they think that there's something. Then you also have people with conditions where they're they have the hair that grow out, and you find that like a lot in Mexico and places. Mm-hmm. So there's always a kernel of truth or something that's got kind of twisted, maligned, and made somewhat nefarious. But now we were kind of talking about The Conjuring a little bit.
Yes.
Now, how drastic was the root of that and the truth of the story as opposed to the Hollywood thing? Because just like anything, I talk to people connected with like the Amityville Horror, stuff like that, and a lot of times it's just like, okay, there's about 45% that's pretty close to it, and then the rest of it is just spectacular effects and whatnot, and theatrics.
Right, exactly. And of course there was a lot of Hollywood going into the film and the movie. There were real people that were represented there. Most of them were actual real people, the real names they used, but kind of really the movie The Conjuring, the first Conjuring, really condensed it, and they made the witch Bathsheba out to be the villain that had sacrificed her children, and she'd become like a terrible demonic spirit. But actually, in real life, the real Bathsheba, actually, the historic person, was a prominent member of the local Baptist church. And so that just was rumor. As far as we can tell, that was rumor that sprung up about her and such. But it was actually, from what I experienced, it was a demonic spirit. I've always believed that. I believed that when I was 18 years old when we first came to the house, and I believe it now. It had all the aspects of a demonic spirit. The girls there, the Perrin family lived there, and Carolyn Perrin had been targeted terribly. She was in the barn once, the old barn, and suddenly a scythe, for scything the wheat out in the field, it suddenly leapt off the wall and just missed her head. Just was like thrown at her, just missed her head. She was cutting an orange once, and suddenly it looked like blood spurted out of the orange, but she hadn't cut herself. Just terrible things were happening. She just got out of the bath once and was drying herself off, and a coat hanger leapt off and started banging around the head. But she was more afraid for her children than she was for herself, obviously, because her children were being frightened by these spirits. They were actually seeing these spirits visually. And, of course, it makes it look like it all happened within the space of a month, but actually the true story happened over the space of 10 years. The family was going through this for almost a decade that they lived in that house, so it was very, very expansive. But I know when we came there, when we were teenagers, my brother Carl and I were teenagers, the girls were giving me a tour of the property. They showed me the nice pond where they went fishing and won awards for their fishing and everything. But then they took me upstairs and showed me where they were most afraid in the upstairs area, and they used to huddle together in the bedroom. Now, next to me was a window that it was hot. The humidity was very, very oppressive. That window had been open for a couple of weeks in the bedroom. The father, Roger, even tried hammering it down. He just could not get that window closed. So they asked me, what they were telling me what was going on. I asked them, what is your religion? Do you have any religious belief? They said, yes, we're Catholic. So I advised them when you're afraid, try praying and calling upon the name of Jesus. As soon as I said the name of Jesus, that window came slamming down. I'm almost surprised it didn't shatter. That's how hard it slammed down. And one of the girls was slapped by an invisible hand. She was slapped and she went screaming almost off the bed, crying. It's interesting that she was slapped in the left side of the head because the demonic will usually go counterclockwise. Their activity will be counterclockwise. And so she was slapped on the left side of the head, which was counterclockwise. And and you could just feel the energy draining. It was just like pulling right out of us, almost like an electric pulse was pulling right out of us. But I prayed, I kept calling upon the name of Jesus, and then whatever it was just left the room, suddenly left the room. We looked up, all of us could feel it at once. The air was clear, and of course it didn't leave the house, but it did leave the room. So we came downstairs and they were pig-piling me on, kissing me and everything like that. But so I always believed that was a demonic spirit in there. I never believed it was, at least the most evil spirit there, was nothing to do with a human spirit at all. I always believed that was an inhuman demonic spirit. It responded to religious provocation. Its activity was counterclockwise. It drained energy from people. So in a way, that was almost like a psychic vampire because it did drain energy from people. And Carolyn, the mother, after years of living in this house, she began wasting away very rapidly. She didn't die. They eventually moved out. But it was a very, very, I would say parasitic. Spirit there was very, very parasitic. And it did appear to Carolyn less than a week later after we were there. It appeared in her bedroom. It just looked like a desiccated corpse. It looked like almost like a living corpse wearing an old dress, old-fashioned clothes, and started spouting this chant to her: "I'll drive you mad with death and gloom. I'll drive you mad with fiery brooms. I'll drive you out, but 'twill be too late. You'll be dead." And so, I mean, this obviously very, very, very upsetting. And so we did actually confer with Ed and Lorraine Warren, and that's how they became involved. They said they would actually come down and become involved in the case. So that's how Ed and Lorraine became involved with it.
Well, and the description that you give and the inclusion of like talking about brooms and stuff, it almost touches on the witch trope a little bit. It's weird how sometimes things tend to kind of cross over.
Yeah.
I know that, like I said, I've been kind of studying this type of stuff, since I was, probably mid-teens. Mm-hmm. And we had started our own little team. It was probably about 2006, and really started kind of going out and seeking out different type of things like that. There were two examples, and then I'm sorry, I don't mean to go on about myself, but there were two examples that I want to cite. One had been a home where there had been a fire, and there had been a death of the grandfather maybe a year or so before, had a heart attack in the house, and they were having activity, and they were like, oh, well, I'm sure let's just call him Al. I'm sure it's Al, he's visiting or something. Mm-hmm. Well, I know myself, I don't confer, or say that I have any sort of gifts, but I do have, and maybe it's just from working in years in corrections and law enforcement, what I call my gut, my intuition. And I can I can feel. You ever walked into a room and there's a physical weight difference? So it's like going from being underwater in 5 foot and going into the 12-foot pool. Oh, and you can feel that pressure around your body. And you can feel it right in your core a lot of times. I have whatever, if you want to call it a gift or ability or whatever. And I was like, no, this doesn't feel like a haunting to me. So we started going around, and we were using, the usual gear, but we also included divining rods, which my family, somebody call them diving rods, whatever, because for getting water. Yes. But we would use that, and kept having issues, and it kept the kids that were living there kept being scared, and we had issues with the rods because my wife would say something like listen, you don't need to terrorize these kids. They're innocent kids, only a coward would do that. And we'd had, like the rods cross over real hard and like hit her across the neck, actually scratched her throat. And then later we were in a rear room where a lot of the activity was, and we heard something slide. and it was actually a large, like one of those industrial box fans that you have.
Yes.
Anyway, they were pretty heavy. The thing went from the corner. We were like about mid part of the room toward the right side of the wall, and it slammed into the right wall about 2 feet in front of us. And that was pretty dang scary. And
wow, yeah, that is scary.
Well, and it was one of those things that and just like the other thing I'll tell you in a minute, it's just it's not. That's where I went. I don't want to chase that every day. And so my hat is off to you for the fact that you have the fortitude and the want and the wherewithal to do that. And the only other one I would tell you is we were talking about regards of using Ouija boards. There was a family that was using some candle magic, and I think a Ouija board, and started out as fun and games and whatnot, and then it gets the obsession comes there, and it gets to be, and instead of maybe on the weekend, every night, and then 2 or 3 hours every night, and then half the day, and they really got some stuff that was holding on to them. My question in regards to that is this, because I had this happen to me. Did you ever have an entity either mock the Trinity in regards of, because I would say the Lord's Prayer, and I had a recording where it would mock what I was saying back to me, and it scared pardon my language, scared the hell out of me, and that is the darkest situation I'd ever been in. In the times that you had studied with, and worked with Ed and Lorraine, was there a piece of advice that he gave you that maybe connected with darker spirits that has kind of been your rod that you held to? Because, there's so many little things people forget, maybe someone says in passing, but it's really full of wisdom. Is there anything that you'd like to share about that?
Always do not challenge. Ed was a sticker about that. Do not challenge it. It's one thing with religious provocation, but do not challenge a spirit on your own merit. Ed was very much a stickler like that, because that could cause a repercussion that could last for years. And he was actually involved in a case many years ago that became rather famous, where a young boy was he was undergoing possession and being tormented, oppressed. A nice young boy, but he was being terribly oppressed and would go under possession. His sister's boyfriend got so tired of seeing that he challenged the spirit. Why don't you try taking me on? And that's Ed. Ed would always say, never do that. Never challenge a spirit on your own merit. Never make it personal. Try never to make it personal, because the spirit will take that as an open invitation and will. I mean, you're actually giving it permission to attack you. So that's what he would say. Don't ever do that. Don't ever challenge a spirit. These spirits have the wisdom of the ages. They are incredibly powerful. It can cause a backlash that will last for years, and you and your family will always be in danger from then on. So that was the advice he gave.
Well, let me ask you too, because when you're talking about generational things, because obviously there's stories of like the Bell Witch and things like that.
Yes.
Do you feel that type of curse, which it was a curse, that carried through generations and
yes,
just played heck on relationships and health and all that? Do you believe that is a thing, and is it still a thing? And beyond that, what would your advice be to avoid any sort of demonic attachment?
Mm-hmm. There's different ways that, of course, demonic attachment can occur. There's the law of invitation, and that's when somebody's communicating with a spirit, and of course they somehow been duped into giving it permission to infest their lives or infest their home. But when there's something in a house or something that's been following for generation, I do believe in generational curses, but I also believe they can be broken. I believe they can be broken through faith, through deliverance. You can have special prayer said over yourself, and somebody who realizes that this is something that's been following. My brother Carl and I were involved in a case of possession involving a 14-year-old boy quite some years ago, and that had been generational. His family, actually, they were practitioners of Santeria, and this one of the relatives was a spirit advisor, or a bruja. She was a bruja, and this boy was in a cemetery with his family once they were walking through. I guess just walking through a cemetery. He saw a glove lying there, and that glove was somehow energized. It was energized with very negative energy. I think it had a demonic attachment. Just out of curiosity, he picked it up, and it clung on to him. And because his family had this generational involvement, he became totally victimized by it, and it lasted for years till he finally started going in his early adolescence, began undergoing demonic possession, and he was just literally two different people. When he was under this personality, he was just totally different. And my brother and I fortunately recognized what it was, and we did come and we assisted in casting it out. Hopefully, he is all right today. We haven't been in touch with him for many years, but that was quite a hair-raising experience. Something I wouldn't want to take on now. Carl and I were a lot younger then, and we really had to do a lot of football tackling him down and things like that. And I was left pinning him down by myself once, and I just was thrown right against the wall. So that got very, very physical. So yeah, that is one example. But certainly, if somebody has something where it's a general or it's in the house or anything, they can have special prayer to protect themselves. The more positive you are, the better. Just make it plain you do not want this in your life, and you are protected by God. You have the shield of faith, and especially reading in the Bible, in the New Testament, Ephesians 6. When we're going into a case, we always read this, Ephesians 6, putting on the armor of God. We find that very, very effective when St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, where he talks about putting on the armor of God, chapter 6, and these demons will actually see this armor. Unless somebody is very, very intuitive, they will not be able to tell, but they will see this. Demons will actually see that somebody is covered by the armor of God, and it's a very, very, very good protection, Ephesians 6. And it's interesting that one time somebody had been prayed for over, and somebody had prayed over, may you be surrounded by the blood of Christ. And there was a psychic medium that saw this person and didn't know that person had been prayed over, but said, I don't know why, but I'm seeing that you are just covered in blood. I just see you covered in blood. And, well, that person was protected by the blood of Christ because that had been prayed in deliverance. So, yeah, I think if you really, really, you see these things happening in your family or in a house you moved into, I would try to get help right away. The more you delay, the more serious it can become. So I would really, really try to get help right away. There is help out there. Of course, we have the internet now. And do an internet search. Make sure somebody's legitimate. But there is always somebody that, even if they're not in your area, they can point you to the right direction.
Right. And I think that's what kind of differentiates a researcher from whatever. I'm not saying that about all ghost hunters. I know some that are they're very good, but as I told you, like on the onset of this, if I walk upon something and I'm not comfortable with it, I don't think I can help you. Right. You can't go into it prideful at all, and just go. I can send you to this guy, or I can make some suggestions what you could do, but please contact your clergyman and whatnot. It is in a way, you be it a demonologist or a shaman or whatever, you like you said, you have to let it go to the higher power and know that it's done through whatever deity and not yourself. Well, let me ask you this too, and in the last few minutes that we got. Now, would you say that activity of the dark demonic entities type has increased? Because you hear a lot of stuff about like shadow figures and hat men and whatnot. And if it is, what do you think the cause of it? Of course, some people go, well, there's different influences and whatnot.
Mhm.
Or do you think it's, to get biblical, do you feel it is that we are drawing closer to an end time?
Yeah. Actually, I do. From my personal experience and Sandra's experience as well, and my brother's, there has been a definite increase in it. People are talking about it more, of course. There has been a definite increase in this phenomena. Shadow figures are much more common, the Hat Man phenomenon and so forth. And I really think that it is building up. Just the way it is so much more, and of course we have mass communication now. I really think it is building up, and I think it is leading toward a climax. I really think it is a sign of the times that this demonic energy and phenomena has increased so dramatically. I really do think it is the sign of the times, but I mean, you have to realize that that does have a happy ending, so to speak, and that we do have God's protection, and that God's protection is available for those who simply ask for it, pray in faith. Like the faith of a mustard seed can move mountains. And I do believe it is a sign of the times, to answer your question, yes.
Well, what do you think? And like I said, and again, I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for you to put out your websites and things like that before we're done with the interview. What do you think the next thing is? I mean, obviously you are rooted in Christian theology and see a time beyond this world and the earth passes away. What do you see something beyond that? Do you feel that once we go through those veils, we'll learn what, and again, kind of get back in some other variants of the paranormal, UFOs are and things like that, and some of these different things that are cited in different, types of interactions with different sort of beings that seem to be maybe non-dimensional. Do you think all that will be explained as well? This masked is this and that? Because, you hear a lot of people talk about when they use Ouija boards and whatnot that, oh, well, we thought it was Granny May, and it wasn't. Right. It was something pretty darn dark.
Right.
What do you expect once you take that trip?
I think things are going to be revealed more and more and more, that there is an interdimensional existence there, and that spirits do cross back and forth at times. I think this phenomenon will become more and more well known. However, I also think that there will be a lot of great deception going along with this before we have the reveal, and of course, culminating in the second coming of Christ, I do believe. I think before then there will be a lot of deception where people are become complacent, and contact with spirits will just be an everyday thing. People are invited in. And of course, remember, demons are masters of deception. And like Ed Warren used to always say, they have the wisdom of the ages. They will use anything to deceive us, whether it's posing as a little child so you'll be sympathetic, or whether it's I believe there will be increased UFO activity. It says in the Bible that there will be signs in the heaven, of course, and I think this will increase. And but also that the demonic will have power to deceive through whatever means possible, and it can deceive through signs in the sky. It can deceive through spirit communication. I think spirit communication will get more and more involved, that it will be more of an everyday thing. It will be in the news, and that there'll be devices, actually, that people will communicate, using a Ouija board or using a spirit box. These will become more and more sophisticated till people actually are deceived that they are talking with an angel of light. They will think that they're talking with an angel of light and these supreme beings, when actually it is a demonic spirit, and it is a deception. Of course, if you use the protection of, say, Ephesians 6, and you actually go, and 1 John as well. If you confront the spirit in the name of Jesus Christ, I don't mean go after it, but if it is there, you do come to it in the name of Jesus Christ. Can see by its reaction whether it backs down or whether it just disappears. That's the test. But I think a lot of people are going to be putting their faith into these spirits, these supposed angel of light people are going to start worshiping them, and it's going to become a great false religion and a great deception. I think that's eventually what will happen prior to the second coming and, of course, the great final battle.
Wow, that's a great way to end it right there, Keith. We're actually right at the end of our hour. Keith Johnson, everybody. Where can they find your books and the other things you're involved in currently, sir?
Well, we go to our site, nearparanormal.com, New England Anomalies Research, so it's NEAR paranormal.com. That's where you can find our Facebook, too. We're on Keith and Sandra Johnson on Facebook. You can find out where our appearances will be and when we'll be speaking next. And our books can be found on our website and on Amazon.com, too, the Paranormal Reality Series. And I'm working on a book on practical demonology, that signs to look for and such, a lot of things what we've been discussing today. And it really, this stuff is becoming more and more, it's really increasing. I know somebody that's, Steve, that's right up by your way, that's in Kentucky, right near your way, that this family has been dealing with this for years, and the husband is a minister too, and they've been spirit manifestations, animals dying, they've been attacked because they are good people. Just because they're good people, they've been attacked left and right.
Yeah, and that's the thing people don't think about. It's sort of like that old joke about who's the wildest kids in town, the policeman or the mayor's or the preacher's son. That seems like hardship comes to those who are trying to do something positive. No good deed goes unpunished, as it were. But Keith, I'll tell you what, we're at the end of it, and if you will stick around long enough, I will do this quick outro and be right back with you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And there you go, folks. Mr. Keith Johnson. Very wise man. And it's so funny because I knew we were going to be touching on some stuff, and it definitely was entertaining, but it also made me think. It gave me some stuff to work through on my own spiritual end, and that's always a good thing. But I hope you guys enjoyed the show. I want you to get out there and enjoy that sunshine and all the fruits of God's love. But as the shadows grow long, as the sun sets behind the pines, make sure to check beneath your bed, in your closet, down the back hallway, because you never know what you might encounter there. But sometimes in fear is learning, so embrace it and make a positive out of it. But until next time, everybody, take care and stay scared.